Hey, good evening, class. Tonight's video is going to teach you how to do a rhetorical analysis in an essay format. We're going to look at a letter from Benjamin Banneker to Thomas Jefferson, and we're going to talk about the process of rhetorical analysis and everything that it includes. Rhetorical analysis is a pretty useful skill, not only for completing a very thorough and effective essay and honing a very important composition skill, but it's going to help you be a more critical reader and more critical just a critical observer in life when people are coming at you trying to convince you of points and looking at what do effective arguments use and what are tools that you can use when you're trying to help convince an audience of a message. So when you look at rhetorical analysis, the first two things that you want to make sure you clearly understand are what's the definition of rhetoric and what's the definition of analysis. And simply put, when we're looking at rhetoric, we have Aristotle's classic definition. And we have the faculty of observing, in any given case, the available means of persuasion. So rhetoric is about being persuasive and about what tools are you using, or is any author using, in order to be effective and to achieve his or her message. Now, the next thing we want to do is understand, when we're analyzing rhetoric, what exactly are we doing and what are we looking at? This definition of an analysis talks about the process as a method of studying the nature of something, or of determining its essential features and their relations. Now, when we talk about that first part of the definition, if you look here, it says studying the nature of something. The nature of something that I want to highlight out to you in any type of rhetorical text is an author has a purpose, and that's going to be the centerpiece of our rhetorical analysis. What's our author's purpose? What is our author trying to convince the audience of? Now, for it to be a true rhetorical analysis, we're going to look at what are the tools the author is using. And that's this second part of the definition. It says determining the essential features and their relations. The essential features in this rhetorical analysis we're going to be looking at today are what are the rhetorical devices and how are they being used to help the author achieve his purpose. All right. So when we're looking at this, also, we're looking at the relationship. We're discussing about what an author is using to deliver a certain type of message to a certain type of audience. And you have to realize that all of these things are going to be interconnected. And they're all going to come under a larger backdrop of a situation at hand as to why these people are talking. Let's take a look at a specific example and look at a typical rhetorical analysis question that you'll see on the AP Language and Composition exam. All right, this is a test question from the 2010 released AP examination. It's going to be question 2. And you have the instructions for the prompt right here. Now, first and foremost, there's this idea of exigence. And exigence basically is the reason why people are talking. Why is Benjamin Banneker talking to Thomas Jefferson? It's going to be who's talking, what's inspiring the conversation. And when you read these instructions, not only are there going to be critical elements to look at in the text that you will be breaking down and analyzing, but for the purpose of writing your essay, there's going to be a lot of useful information in these instructions that you want to hone in on when you write your rhetorical analysis. All right, let's take a look at them. First of all, read to yourself for a moment and see if you can identify some of the critical aspects of this question, which are establishing a stage for this conversation. All right. So hopefully you picked up on the author. And it starts with him, Benjamin Banneker. And there's some key identifying features. The son of former slaves, a farmer, astronomer, a mathematician, a surveyor, and author. We have a time frame, 1791. And he wrote to Thomas Jefferson. And they add some interesting details about him. Framer of the Declaration of Independence, Secretary of State to President George Washington. And then we have this critical last part, because these are the specific instructions that are telling you how and what to write. They tell you to read the letter and then look at the strategies, the rhetorical strategies Banneker uses to argue against slavery. Now, one of the important things I said a moment ago is that rhetorical purpose, that is the centerpiece. And the whole centerpiece of this whole argument is this whole idea of arguing against slavery. Now, there's a lot of factors at play, and the really important thing you want to realize is that you're going to be writing a composition, you're going to be writing an essay, where you are showing your understanding of the devices that Benjamin Banneker is going to use. And so in this introductory paragraph, it's pretty critical to establish some of these key factors that are happening in this paragraph or in this letter. All right. Most importantly is you want to see the relationship between these three things: the speaker and the author, the audience, and what's the purpose at hand. We're trying to convince Jefferson to take a stand against slavery. By the time you're done with this too, you're going to see how there's an interplay where many of these things are interacting on multiple levels. All right, let's get into the letter. Now, when you look at this letter, first I want to encourage you to pause for a moment and scan it and take a look at what are some of the key elements that are being used in this introduction to catch Jefferson's ear on this issue of slavery. All right. So here are some of the elements and some of the details that stood out to me. Use of the word sir, this reference to the Revolutionary War. And then we have some interesting language about human aid being unavailable, and then some subtle religious language giving us a more moral sense of the topic at hand. Now, one of the things you may have noticed on that last slide is at the top there was that critical question which is framing this whole analysis. How is Banneker using these things in order to convince Jefferson to take a stand against slavery? So let's look at those details again. The use of the word sir. Banneker might be using this to establish some respect. And how will that affect Jefferson on this issue? It'll probably create a willingness to listen to the argument. You have this interesting reference to that state of the colonies when it was under the rule of the British Crown. And what will this do for Jefferson? Well, it's going to remind Jefferson of the pain of being constantly under servitude to another group. Maybe it'll create some empathy. Maybe it'll create some willingness for Jefferson to act. Then we have that really great religious language and this idea that human aid appeared unavailable. And here at this point, Banneker is very subtly introducing that something greater is at work when a group of people are offered the opportunity to be free, to kind of have some self-control over their own determination and their own factors in their life. So what we're doing is we're planting some seeds that this is important. Now, how does this all relate back to slavery? Well, as we go on, we're going to see that he's going to take advantage of this to show Jefferson how important slavery is and how he needs to look at what is his role directly with this institution. Let's look at the next paragraph in the letter. Again, read it to yourself and see at this point, we're just going to break it down to what's probably the most important thing being mentioned here. Go ahead, scan it for a moment. All right, hopefully you've unpaused the video now and let's take a look. I hope that the most glaring thing that stood out is this wonderful quote that Banneker uses from the Declaration of Independence, a piece of writing that Jefferson wrote himself, and where he praises Jefferson on how he came up with this brilliant idea of freedom and how he saw it as a critical foundation piece for the new country that was being started. Now, at this point, you got to realize if you're Jefferson and Banneker is speaking to you like this, you probably feel pretty good about yourself. And, you're being praised and you're really being held upon a pedestal as someone who really values freedom. But remember, we're looking at this, and how is Jefferson being convinced to argue against slavery? How will he respond? Now take a moment to pause this paragraph and look at what are the glaring details that are standing out in this that are being used to affect Jefferson. Go ahead, pause the video. All right. Hopefully some very, very, some strong language jumped out at you. Let's take a look at some of the words that were being used here. Pitiable, fraud, violence, groaning captivity, guilty, most criminal act. Now all this language is being used to describe Jefferson's shameful participation in slavery. As the author of the Declaration of Independence, he also has to face the fact that he was enslaving people on his own property. He bought slaves. He owned people. Now at this point, you have to realize, how is this being used to convince Jefferson to take a stand against slavery? And it's interesting. Sometimes good rhetoric can be puzzling because how on earth would you get someone to agree with you and take a stand on an issue important to you by shaming them? We are reminding Jefferson in harsh detail of his sin of slavery, and he has been shamed. And one of the things you might be wondering right now is, how can that be persuasive? Well, if we're doing a good analysis of this, we're looking at this in chronological order, and we're seeing how Banneker is directing and building and kind of influencing Jefferson to think a certain way. And at this point, you have to realize that if Jefferson's reading this and taking this to heart, after being praised as the author of Declaration of Independence, he's been reduced pretty low as someone that's involved in this shameful act. So when you're down in the dumps, well, there's only one way to go, and that's up. So let's take a look at this next paragraph and look at what's Banneker doing to kind of highlight to Jefferson to actually take a stand and maybe look at the institution of slavery and see what he can do. All right. Again, pause the video and read and see what stands out. Hopefully what you're going to be seeing is this Christian reference to the book of Job in the Bible. Now, Banneker says to Jefferson, "Put your soul in their soul's stead. Thus shall your hearts be enlarged with kindness and benevolence towards them." And we can identify the rhetorical device as a biblical reference. And at this point, let me point out, it's not necessary to kind of identify all these rhetorical devices with their specific and technical names. Because out in the real world, are you going to stop and point out that an advertisement's making a literary allusion? Probably not. The important thing is to understand what's happening in the actual content and how is that content being used to achieve an effect on the audience. Now, if you happen to have the insight to call it by its academic name, maybe syntax, maybe you can get really technical with it and come up with some of these different rhetorical terms like anadiplosis and anaphora. But basically, the core of a good rhetorical analysis is seeing the obvious. And let's take a look at what should be happening in this last paragraph. What we have to do at the end is ask ourselves, was the purpose of Banneker achieved? And what we have here at the end is probably one of the most effective rhetorical devices that is used at the end of any speech or any type of text that's trying to convince an audience to something, and that's the call to action. With this offering of putting his soul, Jefferson's, in their soul's stead, the souls of the slaves, Jefferson, after being shamed, is kind of offering a spiritual, an empathetic solution. What we have here, if he takes action, it could be an act of redemption for himself. As one Christian speaking to another, you have to see that after feeling so shamed, taking action against the state of slavery could actually be an act of forgiveness for Jefferson. Now, I've given you a lot of information to think about, and what you really want to identify is, how does this all come together in an essay? And at the link at the bottom of this page, you're going to find 3 essays that are answers to that original prompt. Be sure to read the rubric and see what are the identifying features that are being rewarded for in the essay for clarity and showing that you understand what a rhetorical analysis is. And make sure at the end of that document that you're linked to, at the end of those essays you read that answers this and kind of takes all of the ideas we've been talking about and puts them on paper, read the description of the essays and understand why they were given the scores that they were given from the rubric. I hope this has been helpful, and you all know how to contact me. Thanks.